Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC Summer Split Week number 2 overview and analysis video. We are back here with the LEC. Week number 2 is in the books. I really like this new structure. There are only 2 days in the LEC per week now, and I think that generally is better for the league overall. We have 4 full weeks total of the best of ones before we jump in to the best of 3 stage. I think it gives these teams a lot more time to get prepared, a lot more time to adjust and adapt to the current meta to kind of get things under their belt before they are just either thrown in or out of the best of 3 stage. And so generally, I think this was a good change overall. Of course, this lines up better with every other region as well. So we move into week 2, and it's only going to be 10 best of ones to talk about here today. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you want to see my thoughts on week number 1, check it out up in the iCard right now. Up there is also going to be my LEC primer video. You can check out what I thought about these teams before any of the games were played in the summer split. Where was I right? Where was I wrong? You know, I certainly wasn't perfect on a lot of these. Definitely some teams have over or underperformed my expectations, but I would love to know who is over or underperforming your expectations down in the comment section below. Who do you like? Who do you not? Who do you think looks good? And who do you think definitely needs to start looking better before they start moving into these last couple of weeks? You know, there are a lot of teams that are on the borderline of being bottom 2, and obviously that would be a disaster for some teams that are looking to get enough points to make the season finals. So, you know, without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we talk about. And at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10 at the end of the week as well, to give you an idea of where I think these teams are landing. But as I always say, when it comes to the LEC, more than almost any other region in the world, including like tier 2 regions, power rankings mean absolutely nothing. Teams are so volatile. They can be so good one week, so bad the next. We really don't know the power level of these teams until we get into the best of 3s, and really until we get into the best of 5s. So take everything in best of 1 with a grain of salt. We've only seen these teams play 3 games up until this point. Even after this week, we'll only have seen them play 5. So, you know, with all that being said, let's jump right into day number 1. Of course, only 2 days to go over, 5 games each day, and kicking off day number 1 was an undefeated matchup, a 3-0 versus 3-0 matchup between Team BDS and SK Gaming. That SK is actually going to pick up a pretty huge win in. We talked about it last week. We talked about how SK just needed to carry this momentum. We've seen this story before. We have seen this script before, where SK dominates week number 1, where they look really good in the first week and then just can't hold on to that momentum. The element of surprise, their early meta reads, they're just not able to carry them over what is fundamentally a worse mechanical team than maybe a lot of the other ones at the top of the standings. But here we are in week number 2, and it looks like those mechanic problems have been fixed. I think Irrelevant, Niski, they're very good solo laners. I've been pretty high on them throughout the entirety of the year. Isma has had really good moments, but he has been questionable, but none of that is going to matter with the imported bot lane here. This is just a complete difference maker. Rahel and Luan, I don't think this is going to be a controversial statement, at least through the first 4 games or so, are clearly the best bot lane in the LEC. It's not even remotely close, and it really does bring up a really interesting point. We had guys like Ice and Noah come in and look really good. Those players were just okay in the Challengers League. They weren't dominant in the ERLs. Now you're actually bringing in a couple of players who were very good in the Challengers League. Rahel, in particular, was a very highly touted prospect coming out of Damwon's system in the Challengers League, and look what he can do immediately. This is the opening that LEC teams have just not found out yet. ADC is super weak at the LEC level, and when you really get a good one, it can start being a problem. But Rahel is not my player of the game. That's going to go to Luan in the support position on this Alistair. Those engages were just near perfect. This guy is absolutely cracked. This bot lane in general is absolutely cracked, and I wouldn't say they were the best bot lane in the LEC if it weren't for both of them playing at a super high level. Both of them have played really well in all 4 of this team's games, and, you know, I'm really just impressed to see what Luan in particular could do. I think Rahel had a pretty high floor in terms of what we expected because he was so good at the Challengers League level, and we kind of knew a little bit more about him in terms of prospect pedigree, but Luan coming over, of course, from Nongshim HH, as he was formerly known in the Challengers League, league, he has been exceptional for this team, continuously creating as the primary engage threat, and then also doing a great job appealing for Rahel in a lot of these late game team fights. Knows his role very well, knows how to transition a lead into the late game and protect that lead so that his carries can do their job. That's the most important thing for a support right now, and he does it very well, but Rahel is the carry on this team. Do not get it twisted. I know his scoreline, he was only involved in 12 of the 20 kills. He was the primary carry in the back half of this game on the Kai'Sa. He is unbelievable. By far the most talented AD carry in the LEC. It's not even, remotely close. We've been talking about it all year. AD carry at the LEC level is the weakest it's ever been, and maybe it's the weakest I've ever seen a major region be. I just don't think there are any ADCs that I feel good about. We've been talking about Hansama and Ice and, Karzi as like the top AD carries at this level, and that's really not a good sign. Like, that's really not what you want to see. I like Supa, I like someone like Ice, but Rahel's upside is so much higher than those players, and he has so much more of an ability to take over games that when you see him come in and just dominate instantly, especially because he has a good support, it's not surprising. So he's bouncing, back, or I guess continuing onwards from his fantastic week number 1. The rest of this team is doing well. They always had a pretty decent top side of the map. Irrelevant and Niski, like I said, were solid. Isma is playing well on these tank junglers, Maokai, the Sejuani. These are things that he struggled on in previous splits. He's still not, really dominating games. Like, I still want to see a little bit more out of him. It's clearly off of his comfort style. He's definitely more of an early game jungler. We saw that in the winter split. Once he was taken off of that play style, he definitely played worse. And, I don't know if that necessarily fits this team. And so Isma is definitely going to be my biggest concern when it comes to SK going far. But Irrelevant's fine. Maybe a little bit flippy for me. When he loses a little bit harder than other top laners. But when he wins harder as well. And then Niski is a player that I continuously think is underrated. I still see him get a lot of hate in comment sections. I think Niski is generally very, very good, and he has been for a majority of the year. I get that there are going to be moments where he loses games for the team. I think I even got a comment about that, but I guess my response to that would be name a mid laner at this level who doesn't. Humanoid loses games for Fnatic all the time. Maybe not as much this year, but every top mid laner and really every top carry in the LEC actively loses games for their team pretty regularly. Niski's upside is just right up there with everybody else. I still think that he has to be in the conversation for a top 3 to 4 mid in the LEC, and I think he continuously proves that. So SK looking great, and BDS, it sucks that you lose here. 3-0 was a great start. 3-1's not the worst thing in the world. This team is one of those that feels like they're going to be able to beat anybody who's not on their A game, and anybody who is probably just going to be more talented than them. I'm not going to say that that's going to be the case entirely, but it's certainly something that, kind of has the vibe. Dud of the game is going to go to Ice. He was exceptional in week number 1. It really felt like it was going to be his meta with Jinx and Zeri and a lot of these late game team fighters coming into meta. He gets the Jinx here, but quite frankly, he's just not as good as Rahel on the other side of this matchup, and that became abundantly clear. He couldn't do damage, he couldn't lane against the Kai'Sa, and that's a problem. Like, Luan completely shut him down in the 2v2. Labrav wasn't helping much, but Ice was the one who felt most outclassed here for BDS, and especially because he was kind of the carry in week number 1, that's definitely a bit disappointing. I think everybody else had their moments. Varus mid is something we're going to see a lot more as we continue to go throughout week number 2 here. I don't really know how I feel about it. I get it as an answer to Corky, but I think it's just weaker, and I think we saw that here. Rumble Jungle, I think, could do something interesting, and I really like the matchup in particular into what SK have. They just couldn't really do anything with it, and Adam trying to pull out the Mordekaiser to beat the Skarner kind of worked. Like, Mord does a lot of damage, and, he's just generally going to be useful because of the ultimate. But again, bot lane lost super hard, and BDS just generally didn't have tempo in this game, and so SK was able to win it. Really, really huge win for SK. Not a horrible loss for BDS. If they can bounce back, if they can end the week 4-1, they're not going to be all that upset. But SK going 4-0 to start this split is about as dream of a scenario as you can get, and quite frankly, the addition of this bot lane has made them a contender. I saw some people saying, oh, they always had a great top side. They just needed a functional bot side. They just needed to get rid of Execake and DOS to be a contender. I personally disagree with that sentiment. I think topside is still fine. Like, there's still a middle tier topside. I don't think topside would indicate that they should be competing at the top level. I think the difference is that I think they just got the best bot lane in the LEC imported in, and that's going to make almost any team in the league a top 3 contender. So really excited for SK. They could potentially be looking at a world spot this year. And then moving on to our second game of day number 1, and 3-0, 1-2, pretty easy matchup to predict here. It's Fnatic taking on Rogue, and Fnatic does get the job done. They looked great in week number 1. They are going to be the next team to move to 4-0. It's them and SK moving into that next day, which makes their matchup tomorrow very, very interesting. We will, of course, talk about that in this video, but for now, let's talk about Fnatic's win over Rogue. This is not a huge, shocking upset. They absolutely obliterated them. Rogue actually went out and drafted a comp that I think is almost impossible for for them to execute in terms of how they like to play the game, although I do think it's a little bit better than maybe Reddit would like to make it believe. I understand that Rogue is a team that wants to scale into the late game. A lot of that has to do with Larson. Marcoon is a player that I think you can theoretically put on Nidalee and have him do something, and I think if you are going to play to a lane in the early game, it probably should be Finn in the top lane. Top side of the map is generally going to be your most aggressive side for Rogue, but that being said, Renekton and Nidalee is so against what Rogue wants to do, and it's also so against what the meta in the LEC has kind of become through the first couple of weeks here, and I think that really hurt them. For Fnatic, they are just so much more talented than Rogue that it almost wasn't even remotely close. They have looked unstoppable through their first 4 games here. They look like maybe the best team in the LEC in terms of performances. I said that last week, and that's a really cool thing to see. Player of the game is going to go to Noah in the bot lane. Somebody played Corki AD carry, and they demolished. Like, what a shock. I've been talking about this for a while. I'm honestly stunned that this champion has not been flexed down here more. I think it is good in the mid lane. I don't want to seem like I'm trying to complain about it being picked mid. I think it can do a lot of interesting things. It still is a really good late game team fighter, but in the bot lane, it is so much more than that. It really disrupts a lot of the very good AD carries right now, and I think it's just a lot more valuable than people are giving it credit for. Fnatic, the first team to actually flex it down there, and it destroyed them. The Senna had absolutely no chance. The 2v2 was completely unreasonable for the side of Fnatic. They obliterated it. A lot of that credit has to go to Jun. A lot of that credit has to go to Noah. I think both of them were excellent. The Nautilus was essentially just farmed for gold instead of actually farming for the Senna. And a lot of that was just the real amount of damage that Corki can put out so consistently. He's just a really good champion, and I think he's going to continue to raise his win rate and his viability down in the bot lane. It's funny, I think the bot lane meta, at least my read, seems to be very different than pro. I think Corki, Jhin, Ashe, they seem like the most valuable bot lane champions right now, as we're seeing in a lot of the eastern regions to at least consistently carry games. It's not the direction a lot of LEC teams want to go. You know, Senna still seems to be a pretty high priority target. I think Jinx is also playable, but, you know, it's interesting to see the teams that have adapted. You know, Fnatic has a very good meta read. I think MSI helped with that, and I think the bot lane is showing that. Jun continues his kind of breakout from the playoffs in the spring split. That seems to be entirely legit. I wasn't entirely concerned that he was just going to drop back down to being bad, but I was concerned that he was just going to be good, like not necessarily the best support in the region. He's still playing like the best support in the region right now, which is a really cool thing. Huge support gap, although it's Rogue's bot lane, so I'm not going to, you know, freak out over that one. Razork, Humanoid, Oscar, all looked really good. Everybody on Fnatic looked really good. You don't win in 28 minutes, 14-3, absolutely demolishing a team with Renekton Nidalee unless you are just kind of better than the opposition, and that's what they were, so not going to complain too much there. And then for Rogue on the other side, this team is just bad. I got a comment last week where it was like, Rogue should probably stay number 10. You know, I'm not against that decision. I don't completely disagree. I still think Rogue is a team that I would bet that wouldn't make it out of the bottom 2. I don't think this team will make it into the best of 3 stage. I still don't think that they are very cohesive. I still don't think they have the talent to do it, but this bot lane in particular is just garbage. Zoelise is going to get dud of the game. Comp and Zoelise have no chemistry. Zoelise has only gotten worse as the year has gone along, which is frustrating because I think there was some interesting stuff at the beginning of winter, but spring was horrible. Summer right now has been horrible for him. He just does not look good. Very frustrating here for the one player that Rogue invested in as like a young up-and-comer. And Comp is, I'm not going to say washed, because that feels like a very overused term, or, you know, that and fraud. Like, there's such overused terms and buzzwords in the community that I don't really feel like I want to use them, but Comp has just not been good this year, really, under any circumstance, just as he wasn't good last year. So this bot lane continuing to get beat. You know, the Renekton Nidalee absolutely did not work out. I was tempted to give dud of the game to Marcoon in the jungle because he played so safe on the Nidalee, refused to go out and make a lot of plays, and that really hurt Rogue's chances. Finn got beat in the top lane, really didn't get to do anything, and Larson just had to be there on the Azir in the mid lane watching his team lose around him. It's a frustrating situation if you're on Rogue because it really doesn't feel like you can do a whole ton. The MO of the team is just kind of wait until the enemy team makes a mistake, and that could be 25 minutes into the game, and they don't really push their advantages at all. So it is a bit frustrating. Rogue still has some opportunities to potentially get themselves out of bottom 2. They already got their win in week 1, but this is a uniquely suited meta for them because games are going long, so long as they don't force the games to go a lot shorter. Losing to Fnatic isn't the end of the world, but you can't continuously get destroyed like this. And then for Fnatic, they look like the best team in the LEC right now. Them and SK are the 2 only undefeated teams moving into day number 5, and that's definitely going to be an intriguing matchup. I'm really excited for Fnatic. They've bounced back from MSI really well, and I hope they can keep this up. Then moving on to our middle game of day number 1, and it's a battle of the pseudo-yellow teams as Mad Lions Koi takes on Team Vitality, and Vitality is going to pick up the win. They're going to move to 1-3. They're going to win their first game of the split, and this is why I told everybody to pump the brakes on all the Vitality slander last week. People were saying that there's no way Vitality makes top 8 or whatever. You know, LEC fans can be quite reactionary, and I told people to wait. Like, we've seen this team struggle early on in splits before, figure things out as things go along. They have a new jungler. Obviously, that affected communication in some way, shape, or form. A lot of underperformances last week. I know Hylissang can be rather flippy, and so you can't really count on him being perfect in any particular game, but Photon, VTO, they were both really bad in week number 1, and I just don't know if that was something I expected to continue moving into the rest of the split with how talented they are. And fortunately, I was right to pump the brakes on it. Now, I'm not going to say this team has fixed all of their problems, but this was a good performance. Player of the game is going to go to Carzzy. He locks in his signature Ezreal, and he does really well on it. We're seeing Ezreal actually be a super high-value pick across the world right now. Famously, Pays just completely decimated some teams on it in the LCK this past week, but Carzzy obviously is known for his Ezreal. He's really good on this champion. It's really hard, because I do want to talk about this in a way that is going to make some people who watch this video mad, but it's just the reality of how I see the situation. I do think Carzzy is, quite frankly, overrated. I think that he continuously gets a lot of praise on this team for things that he really isn't doing. Like, a lot of times he's just being a low-impact AD carry in the same vein as Patrick, and then when you look at earlier this year, when you look at the times where this team was trying to play a lot more aggressive down on the bottom side, where, you know, Hylissang was getting yelled at for everything, a lot of it was Carzzy not following up or Carzzy being too far forward. I think people forget a lot of the bad games that Carzzy had at the beginning of the year. I get it's selective memory. I get he's really funny on Twitter. I get people really like him, but this is a good performance. I'm not trying to, you know, dissuade this. The reaction to this game seems to be like, oh, Carzzy infinitely better than Supa, where, yeah, like, he was better in this game. We're going to talk about Supa in a second. Made a couple of pretty critical errors in positioning on the Zeri, but I just don't know how you could make the argument that Carzzy has been better than Supa across all of 2024. I think that would be a pretty ridiculous thing to say when talking about all of the games. That's just my personal opinion. It's funny because now I have this reputation of a Carzzy hater, as I'm aware of in my comment section, but when you go back to like 2022, I was getting yelled at on this channel all the time for being too high on Carzzy. It's always funny how things like that end up changing. I'm usually just a little bit early, so hopefully that ends up being the case again. I think Carzzy's skill level will equal out. He's a good AD carry, just not a consistent one. Again, he's kind of the prototypical B-graded AD carry, where he's going to have performances like this, especially on champions like Ezreal, where he looks fantastic, and then, you know, maybe next week he has a performance where he goes 0-8 and just completely runs it. That's how Carzzy has been all year long. It's how he's been for his entire career. I'm not really expecting anything to change here, but I do really like how Hylissang played on the Alistair. A couple of really nice engages. Again, he's going to continue to look for aggressive plays. He's not going to stop just because he had a bad week in week number 1. That's not how Hylissang plays. I expect those plays to continue to turn around. Once the team gets on the same page, they're going to be a lot more valuable. Photon and VTO were definitely better. They survived here, and Linsauce in particular I thought was really solid on the Sejuani. He was the main facilitator here in terms of tempo for Vitality, and that's a huge thing for them overall. So, good game. I'm not trying to discredit them, but I do think some of the conversation is getting a little out of control. I think it's being directed in areas that I personally wouldn't agree with, and, you know, I guess I just wanted to put my 2 cents in on that. And then for MDK on the other side, this was a frustrating game, and this team has become a very frustrating team. If Supa and Alvaro are losing, they don't have any way to win games. I like Elyoya. I think Fresskowy is, you know, a lot better than I expected him to be, but this top side is not really doing anything. This entire team has relied on this bot lane so far in 2024 to win them games. It's why they made finals in the winter split. It's why they were competitive really in spring and why they leveled up over the course of the best of 3s. This team has just not really been good unless their bot lane is good. That's how much this bot lane matters to this team, and they were not good in this game. They got outplayed. Supa's going to get dud of the game here on the Zeri. Couple of mispositioning errors. He is also relatively inconsistent. This is why he also got a B grade. You know, these two players were the same grade in terms of my rankings, but it's definitely interesting. I think Supa's upside is really, really high, and the good games are a lot more prevalent than the bad games for him, but sometimes he will have those bad games. He actually grades out really positive outside of some of these performances, so I'm not going to say that he's horrible in this area, but him and Alvaro definitely need to start stepping it up, because again, if they're going to have a rough stretch, if they're going to underperform even for a little bit, like MDK can't survive that. Mirwin's one of the weakest top laners in the league in terms of actual laning stats, especially when he's not on things that are weird and, you know, Varus top and, you know, things like that. He, outside of those games, is genuinely one of the worst top laners in the league and has not been able to hold up basically in any matchup, especially after winter. Spring was bad. Right now, summer has been even worse. Really bad start to the split for him. Elyoya and Fresskowy don't really seem to have a ton of like proactivity to them. Elyoya has been on Ivern duty a lot, and he got out jungle by Linsauce in this game, which is not ideal, and Fresskowy really couldn't do anything on the Corki either. VTO was better, and so again, if this bot lane's not winning, they don't really have a lot of other avenues to win games. I think Supa and Alvaro are just too important for MDK for them to be struggling right now, and that's why they're 1-3. But Vitality also now sitting at 1-3. They just want to get themselves out of the bottom 2. If they can make top 8, this team's going to be really scary to face off against in a best of 3. They're very adaptable. They have some really interesting pieces that can perform well on any given day. They're very volatile. That's why we ranked them so high at the beginning of the split. I think their upside is definitely there, but there's still a lot of consistency that they need to show that isn't just erased in one win. And then moving on now to game number 4 here of day 1. Another interesting matchup, Team Heretics taking on Corp. And Heretics is going to pick up a pretty important win. Both of these teams now moving to 500 at 2-2 to start off here. Heretics should theoretically be better than Corp, even with the upgrades, in my opinion. I think that their roster is just too talented to be down here at 8th in the power rankings, 1-2. I think this is a win they should have gotten, and it's a win they did get. I think it's a weird meta fit for them because they really have two like good performing players right now, like 2.5. I'm not going to shit on Zviru. I think he's doing fine considering the circumstance he is in. But Yankos and Vlakid versus the world, like that's really what Team Heretics has become. It does kind of work out for them because both of them are playing well right now. But for Corp, they just didn't really have an answer. When they play against teams with really good bot lanes, they're just not really able to survive because they have a really bad bot lane in terms of 2v2ing. And, you know, as good as Upset has been in terms of surviving and getting into the late game, they just don't really exert the same kind of pressure. And we saw that here. They drafted Caitlyn and they still weren't really able to do all that much in the early game. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is pretty easily going to go to Vlakid. He is the driving force for Heretics right now. And quite frankly, I'm all in on Vlakid. I know I've been a bit low on other AD carries coming out of Europe, especially like actual European AD carries, you know, not Rahel and Ice and players like that I think have been really good, but like the endemic AD carries at this level, I think Vlakid is probably better than someone like a Karzi right now. I think he's probably better than someone like an Ice right now. Honestly, I think Vlakid is about as good as someone like Hansama right now, really with the performances that he's putting in. Can we really say otherwise? He's been super consistent for this team. All he does is perform. All he has been is good at the LEC level. I know he's not the flashiest player in the world, but I love consistency. If there's anything that you guys know about me, it's that I really like the knowledge that game in, game out, you're going to be a positive on your team, and you just don't really get that with those other ADCs like Karzi, Hansama, like the best AD carries in the region. They're going to have some bad games every once in a while because that's just how they operate. Like that's how those players are. Vlakid doesn't really give you that downside. He is going to have some up and down performances, but those down performances are a lot more muted compared to the others, even if the ups are, you know, a little bit more muted as well. And I think that's more valuable for a team like Heretics that needs to rely on him game in and game out right now. So, you know, maybe I'm too high on Vlakid, maybe I'm too low on Karzi. Be sure to yell at me in the comment section below, but Vlakid's really good, and he continues to punish really bad laners. His former lane partner, Targamas, was not particularly good in this game, and Vlakid took advantage of that, did a really good job. I think Trimby had one of his more complete performances in a while. He has really disappointed me here on Heretics. I think he's been one of the worst players on the team, and that's really not what I expected. I thought that, you know, these two were going to work well together because Trimby is such a 2v2 focused kind of player, and obviously that works when you're playing Corp's bot lane, who are not good in the 2v2 and really struggle in that area of the game, but against other teams, it's just not been as successful, which I think is definitely a bit of a disappointment. It was good here, though. I'm not going to complain about it too much. Yankos, Zviru, also fine. Again, Corki's just going to be a general safety net for the late game in case things go wrong, and Yankos on the Maokai is able to facilitate a lot of this stuff. Wunder was fine on the top side. He didn't die in this game, which is generally good. He's actually been a bit of a disappointment for me as well. I've been really kind of underwhelmed with how Wunder has been able to play a lot of the 1v1s. He loses super regularly up on the top side. Hopefully that doesn't end up continuing, but Vlakid is the guy here for Heretics, if that was ever in question for you. And then for Corp on the other side, this team has good things going for them. They certainly are better than they were in, you know, winter and spring with the changes. However, this is still not a good team. This is still not a team that is going to be competing for a top 4 spot, in my opinion. And I think their weaknesses are still just infinitely too exploitable. A lot of people look at the 2-1 record and say they had a good week number 1. I pushed back on that a lot in week number 1. They got bailed out on that second day against Mad Lions, where essentially Mad just didn't want to win the game, and so Corp was forced to win it. And then, of course, they faced Rogue on the third and final day, which is essentially a free win win. So not the most impressive 2-1, and I think they are crashing back down to earth a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised if this team fell a lot closer to 7th or 8th. I think that that's probably where they are right now. I still think they will be a top 8 team. I think this is going to be the first K-Corp team to actually make the best of 3s, or at least I would imagine. I think they are better than teams like Rogue and GIANTX, who are down at the bottom of the standings, but I don't think it's by a ridiculous amount. And again, those weak links are just too exploitable right now. And the biggest one is Targamas in the support position. Yet another dud of the game for him. He's gotten so many, I think like 7 of these over the course of this year in terms of just the best of ones. He has not been good for K-Corp. There is literally nothing else to say. He has been the worst support in the LEC by a considerable margin, and it's just not working out. I get that this team wants to keep him because either he likes playing with Upset, or alternatively, I've heard rumors that Kalist wants to play with him next year. That's the case. Okay, like, I don't think it's going to help the team, but, you know, Targamas right now is really not making them better. He is absolutely making them worse. Upset playing Caitlyn, it's just not what I would want to do for Upset. You want him on a late game carry. That's where he's going to be the most efficient in terms of how this team likes to operate. I think the Caitlyn trying to win the 2v2, it's just not really how this team wants to play. They weren't going to put resources into it, and it didn't work out. Vladdy's been fine, but not a star. You know, Kana's been fine, but not a star. Closer's been fine, but not a star. These guys are good. They're okay players. Kana and Closer in particular, I think, had good week number 1s, outside of Kana getting solo killed on the top side by Mirwin, but K-Corp is definitely one of those teams that's just, you know, they're good, they're fine, and they have weaknesses. They don't really have a star on this team that I think can carry them over some of the negatives that they have right now, and their weaknesses are pretty exploitable, and I think that's why they are losing, at least at the moment. 2-2 is not horrible, though. This team should still be top 8. And then for Heretics on the other side, this is a fine, functional team. Again, I don't think this is going to be a team that competes for top 4. They probably should be in terms of the talent that they have, but they just have not shown me anything to believe that they can do that right now. Flacket is very good, and Yankos is a player I really trust, but it's just everything else in this team. Viru's fine, but he's not going to, like, push you forward. Wunder and Trimby have to keep up this kind of pace. They have to be able to win consistently. You can't just be a one-lane threat. Right now, that's not necessarily been the case consistently for Heretics, but at least they get themselves back to 500 here. Then moving on to our final game of day number 1. It's a game that had absolutely no business being as close as it was. It was G2 Esports taking on GIANTX, and G2 somehow, some way is going to use their mind control powers to get themselves out of this game with a win. It really should have never even been close. GIANTX had every bit of this game locked up and under control until they just completely threw it away. Mid lane Varus very much worked out for them. It very much was a carry threat, and honestly, the Rumble was so difficult to take down. The Lulu was kind of empowering all of this, and that double marksman comp alongside, you know, Rumble just dropping an ultimate on the backline made it very difficult for front to backs to even be considered for G2, but GX makes some major positioning mistakes. Their main carries are hitting the wrong people for a majority of the final fight, and all of a sudden, this front to back that was supposed to be dominated by Varus and Rumble is now dominated by the big Scorpion once again. Skarner coming in clutch when he needs to. Broken Blade's gonna get player of the game. Skarner's such a weird champ. I really do think you just have to ban this out right now because games are just going too long for Skarner to be allowed in them. Skarner has weaknesses. I'm not going to pretend like this champion is unplayable, like, against. Like, you can't beat it. Like, he's unbeatable, no counterplay. There is a lot of counterplay to Skarner. There are a lot of ways to beat it in the top lane. We've seen that across a lot of the other regions. The problem is that, especially in situations like this, where you're essentially just fighting 5v5 for the fate of the game, if Skarner gets one good, you know, ult off, if Skarner gets one good engage off, the game is over. Like, his power is that high in terms of his ability to impact a 5v5, even from behind, that it really doesn't matter what has happened up until that point. Even though Antonio was better for a majority of this game, Broken Blade was the most important player because he did land that crucial engage in the back half. So he is going to get player of the game. I do want to see him be a bit more consistent in the laning phase. That's always going to be a bit of a concern. I do want to see him just kind of win. I don't want to see him just go into the late game and then win there. I want to see him actually win early on, but Skarner's not really the champion I would expect to dominate doing that. The reason you pick Skarner is because of his inevitability, really, at the end of the day. And it's kind of what we saw here. I think the rest of G2 was bad for the most part. I am going to be pretty critical of how they ended up playing. Hans and Mickey were probably the most salvageable, if only because they weren't just giving over gold left and right to the side of GX, but this jungle mid duo did not have a good game. Caps in particular looked really poor here against Jackie's, who was just straight up better than him, and that's definitely a really funny sentence to say. Jackie's, who was playing in the Czech League last year, is coming into the LEC, and, you know, in his first year, he's able to go toe-to-toe and beat Caps in a 1v1 as Varus, and that's a pretty crazy thing, but Caps generally just had an underperformance. He's had a couple of these over the course of this year. He always has some of these over the course of the year. I'm not worried about Caps. Caps is the last player that I'm going to be worried about. Yike was also a little bit too inactive for me on something like the Xin Zhao. If you're going to be playing Xin Zhao plus Lucian Nami down in the bot lane, you do want to try and push the tempo early, and it felt like this team was a lot more comfortable just scaling into the late game. I get it. You've got Skarner, you've got Corki, you've got tools for the team fight. Lucian's also going to be relatively fine in that stage of the game, but I don't actually think you're better in that stage of the game if you're G2. I think Yike needed to do a lot more. Generally speaking, a lot of things that could have been optimized for G2, but they were gifted a win by GX, and that's really all that matters. And then for GX, how do you end up losing this? Like, truly, how do you take the control of the game that you had and end up, throwing that away to just a Skarner engage? It really is a bit disappointing. Credit to Antonio and Jackie's, the solo laners were excellent in this one, and they have been by far the two best players on this team so far this split. Jackie's, I think that's the expected trajectory. Maybe not expected, but it's a positive trajectory. They brought him in at the beginning of the year with the understanding that he was going to struggle at the beginning, but with the expectation that he was going to get better as he played against these mid laners more and more, and that's exactly what has happened. He has clearly been the best player on GIANTX over the course of the summer split so far. And honestly, he looks really good. Like, he looks like a super playable mid right now. Somebody who could move up to a better team and absolutely hold his own. And Antonio, I think, has been playing better as of the last couple of games. He was good in the final day of week 1. He's really good here in this game on the Rumble. Just those two weren't enough to be able to win it for GX. The weak links, again, on this team, they're the most exploitable pieces. That's kind of the trend across League of Legends so far, is it doesn't really matter how good your best players play. It's about how good your worst players play. You can't have the worst player in a game and feel pretty good about winning that one. It's unfortunate, but Patrick continues to just be absolutely nothing for this team. He's going to get dead of the game. He contributed nothing on Ashe. He was constantly hitting wrong targets, not really being aggressive in terms of his positioning. I think if he had been even a serviceable Ashe, a serviceable AD carry in this performance, it could have been playable for GX. I also think Juhan is just not particularly good right now. He has been maybe the worst jungler at this level so far in 2024 or summer. It's just not been a positive addition for them yet. I'm not sure whether or not Peach is still in consideration to potentially come back into this team. I know Juhan played with Antonio, and perhaps that's going to be a positive for Antonio moving forward, but Juhan has just not been good enough so far. I get he's a former world champion, but he's not like an exciting player. He's not somebody who's going to bring more ceiling to this team. He was a floor, a player. He was a floor player for DRX too. He's a Maokai Sejuani player. That's what he does, and it's right now just not working because the rest of this team can't capitalize on any of that, and he's losing prio in the early game. So a lot of negatives going GX's way. Jackie's is not a negative. Antonio really is not a negative right now, but this team continues to not be able to close out games. Like, they're 0-4 for a reason, even with some of the leads they've gotten. G2 looks very strange, like 2-2, and 3 of those games they probably should have lost. That's not an ideal way to start off your summer split, but at the end of the day, it still is G2. We've seen this team struggle at the beginning of, best of ones before and then figure it out in best of threes, dominate best of fives. I'm not worried about this team. Even if they get rolled in the playoffs, they were still guaranteed, I think, the first seed, like the number 1 seed in the season finals. So there really isn't any sort of concern with G2. They could just be trying stuff out right now. They could be just limit testing. Either way, you want to see GX be able to actually close out this game before you feel better, but G2 is definitely going to feel good moving to 500 here. But now moving into the second day of the week, the second half of week number 2 here, and we kicked it off with a matchup between Team Vitality and Team Heretics, and Vitality is going to pick up their second win of the week. 0-3 in week 1, 2-0 in week number 2. There are some interesting parallels between this team and KT Rolster over in the LCK that I really like to make. I think they are kind of similar in a couple of ways. They're both so volatile in terms of their week-to-week performance, their day-to-day performance, that you really don't know which version of them you're ever going to get, but when they do land, their aggressiveness just looks so good and so clean. It's so difficult to end up taking down these players because they are so mechanically talented when things are going right for them. They're not always going to go right, but when they do work, man, it looks good. For Heretics on the other side of this is just an inconsistent team. I think we at this point know who Heretics is. This is a team that's going to be competing for somewhere around like 6, 7, 8 in terms of the standings. They're not going to be a world's contender. This is going to be a team that at best is going to want to try to make the season finals, and that's a pretty crazy thing to say with the expectation for them going into the year. I had them at number 2, in January when we were talking about these teams and just their rosters on paper. I had them as the second best team in the LEC, and they might not even make the season finals in terms of how they end up performing this year. So certainly not an ideal outcome for Heretics. They are just not a particularly strong or consistent team, but Let's talk about Vitality. Player of the game is once again going to go to Karzi. His Ezreal is just ridiculous. I don't think teams should be allowing it right now. Ezreal is in a good spot. We saw that a lot in the LCK, like I said, over the course of this past week. The champion is very playable. He can carry games. His damage is consistent. He is very, very safe. He doesn't really need a lot of resources. He is kind of what everybody is looking for in the AD carry role right now. It's why picks like Ashe and Jhin have risen in popularity, because champions that are a bit more self-sufficient while still offering a lot of damage are just incredibly valuable in the meta right now to allow you to move your jungler or your support even really elsewhere. And I think Karzi is perfect for that role. He's very good at 1v2ing in lane. He's very self-sustainable on things like Ezreal, and he knows how to carry team fights out of this role. It was a great week for him. You know, I was very critical of him, obviously, in the first game. I do want to say this player of the game does equalize him for the year. I typically don't like to talk about, you know, my yearly player of the game and dud of the game awards, but I do keep track of all of them, you know, winter, spring, and summer, and just try to keep track of who has been getting a lot of player of the games, who has not been getting a lot of player of the games, who's been getting a lot of dud of the games, etc. Karzi has equalized himself. He was -2 going into the week. He had 2 more duds of the game than players of the game, but because he got 2 in a row, he's now equalized, and I think that just goes to show you the, you know, flippability of Karzi's season. There are going to be some games that don't look good. We saw quite a few of those in winter and spring, but we also saw quite a few that looked really good, even games that Vitality ended up losing where Karzi was pretty positive. It's just kind of an interesting conversation. I put him at number 4 in terms of my AD carry rankings. I thought that was pretty respectable, and, you know, he can show up and beat anybody. I've been praising Fnatic a lot, and Karzi was just straight up better than him in this game, which is a really cool thing to see. We know we can perform at a high level. I just want to see it happen over the course of multiple games in a row, rather than there being 1 or 2 games in the middle of those good stretches that just look really poor. So this was a good showing. Hylissang was really good this week after being horrible in week number 1. Turns out Hylissang is going to be fine so long as the team is backing him up, so long as he actually has carries to enable when he's going for these aggressive plays. The problem with him in week 1 was that he was going for a lot of these super ambitious engages and had no follow-up, had absolutely nobody that could take advantage of those, and so he was just dying and looking really dumb for a lot of those engages. But now that he had a carry in the ADC role, it actually looked pretty good. Linsauce is another player I want to point out. Going into Jankos and picking Ivern is huge, and to dominate him in the way that he did is ginormous. Linsauce is a player that I was really excited to see how he adapted to the LEC so far. It's been pretty good. He's been pretty good in week number 2. I think it's really enlightening and a positive sign that he has played 5 different champs in 5 games. I think that shows that he is willing to play a couple of different styles to help out this team wherever he can, and I do think the solo laners play better. VTO is still someone I'm a bit concerned about. He's really not been all that good in summer, but Photon looked a lot more like the Photon that we know in week number 2 than he did in week 1, where he was just losing for no reason. So generally, Vitality looking good. Karzi with a pretty incredible week. Teams might have to start banning out Ezreal. I think it might just be a consistency thing. Not saying Karzi can't play other things, but that champion just looks a little bit too free for how Vitality wants to play the game right now in terms of their playstyle. And then for Heretics on the other side, this is just not a particularly strong team. There really is nothing else to say. Zviru is going to get dud of the game. I like Zviru. I think he's generally fine. I think he's generally been an average mid laner at this level, but he's not a star by any means. He's certainly not someone that grades out as like an exceptional player. The Taliyah here was just not useful at all, was consistently getting caught out, and even if VTO wasn't exactly at his strongest in this game, Zviru still wasn't able to keep up with him in terms of map pressure. Flakked also just not nearly as impactful here in the second game of the week. You know, this is a little bit frustrating. I wanted to see him come out here and just kind of win, because he's been winning so consistently. Karzi did a really good job of shutting him down early in the Zeri. Never really got the chance to get online. He wasn't the problem, but he definitely could have done more. I still think Wunder needs to be better. Like, the big issue that I have with Heretics is that some of their veterans are just underperforming. Wunder, Trimby, they're just not playing up to standard right now, and that continued in this game where both of them just lost and never really had any impact on the game. That's not something that you want to say about 2 players who have been at the top of their positions in the past. They are not playing like veterans. They're not playing like stars at their positions. They're playing like just every other player, like average players to slightly below average players, and that's just unacceptable. Team Heretics is going to walk out of this week below 500, and there's really nothing else to say other than they need to get it together. And then for Vitality, much better week. They're still below 500 because, again, just a 2-0 week, but 2-0 they will take after an 0-3 week number 1. They're definitely on the right trajectory, and I think especially with how this team is playing, I expect them to continue to make improvements as we go along. Then moving on to game 2 here of day 2, and it's a pretty classic regular season matchup between a good and a bad team that you never really know how it's going to go. Rogue taking on G2 Esports, and I think for the first time this year, G2 is actually able to pick up the win here in the regular season. It's funny, this has been by far the best and the worst teams in the LEC so far in 2024, and Rogue has just had their number. It's kind of just how this is gone. Like, it's weird. G2 doesn't take them seriously. Rogue definitely steps it up playing against G2. That organization has always kind of done that. Larssen has actually always played super well into Caps. It's been a really positive matchup for Larssen overall over the course of his entire career, and so there's a lot of things going in Rogue's direction that I don't think a lot of other teams have, but G2 is going to be able to sneak their way out of this one with another victory, although again, it's not really all that dominant. They're not coming out and destroying these games. They're barely getting by, and they are going to go back above 500 here. They're going to move to 3-2, which is a nice place to be, but it's not exactly the most confidence-inducing 3-2 that you've ever seen in your entire life, and so, we'll talk about the things that they're doing right. I still think there really is no other way to look at this team other than if Caps is on, they are going to win any game that they are in. He's going to get player of the game here. He's the best player in Europe. There's really nothing else to say. I'm not going to spoil my end-of-year awards, but come on, dude. Caps is MVP. He's been the best player in Europe. There's almost nothing he could do here in the summer split that would lead me to not voting him as MVP for the year, but he really was that good here. There was a funny moment in the back half of this game where Rogue has a very fed Caitlyn. They have the ability to try and team fight here. Caitlyn's starting to get to that third, fourth item, and you're like, okay, well, they're actually starting to power spike. Caitlyn's going to be a bit of a problem as we go further along into this game, so long as she has the peel. She's got a Gragas, a Maokai, a Blitzcrank. She has so many tools to be able to keep, something like a Tristana off of her. And Caps just jumps into the entire team, jumps right on top of the Caitlyn. The entire team of Rogue just disbands and leaves Caitlyn to die, and all of a sudden the game is, over. It's one of the funniest things that I've ever seen. They just leave their carry to die. I'm not going to blame Comp for that one. What I am going to blame Comp for is just how poorly he was positioning in a lot of these late game team fights. As Caitlyn, positioning becomes significantly easier as the game continues to go along. Yes, you don't have ridiculous mobility, but all you have to do is stay safe for when the fight is starting, allow somebody else to initiate, and then be there to follow up. Comp was just way too over-aggressive, and, we'll get to that. Not a very good game from him, but Caps was there to punish, and Caps was there to seal the deal for G2. Really not a lot else I can say about Caps. My feelings on him as a player. I think the rest of this team was fine. Broken Blade continues to be a really good team fighter, even if his laning still isn't dominating in the same way that he was, last split or even last year. Yike is still very good on facilitators. I think he gets a bad rap for being a carry player. He's very good on the Sejuani. Mickey had a good week. I think that was definitely something that stood out to me, is that Mickey actually played 2 good games in a row, which has not happened in the LEC in quite a long time, so definitely encouraging there. Still not a big fan of Hansama. I still think he's way too far forward and he gets picked off in situations where he doesn't need to be, but, he is serviceable. He was definitely better than Comp in terms of these late fights, and that's all that really matters. He hit the arrows, and again, that's really a game changer, but Caps is the carry of this team. When he's winning, this team is going to win games, and that's really as simple as it gets. And then for Rogue on the other side, they're not good. They crumble under pressure. They had an opportunity to potentially win some of these fights. You have a Corki Caitlyn moving into the front-to-back 5v5, a ton of peel with the Maokai and the Gragas and the Blitz, as we've already talked about. Playmaking potential with things like not only Maokai ultimate, but Gragas flanks, Blitzcrank hooks. There are a lot of ways to get on the backline here if you do want to try to take advantage of the fact that Hansama is too far forward and doesn't really have mobility in a lot of these situations. However, your carry just wasn't particularly good in the back half of this game. Comp is going to get done of the game. It's just so frustrating watching him play, because this is almost identical to Vitality Comp that we got in 2020. This is the version of Comp that I remember from the beginning of his career, where things just weren't working out. Him and Lebrov were just not a particularly strong duo. Lebrov felt like he was trapped with him on that Vitality team, and Comp really emerged getting to play with Trimby. But outside of 2022, again, I want to reiterate, he's really never been that good of an AD carry. He wasn't good before 2022. He really has not been good after 2022. So the one-year wonder continues to kind of be a bit of a problem. He is the worst AD carry in the LEC. I feel pretty confident in saying that. Larssen was also bad. He just is so passive on the Corki. He's so scared of having to fight anyone at any given moment. It is really, really frustrating, even in the late game. Finn, Marcoon, Zoelise, they were whatever. I think Zoelise was actually generally fine here on the Blitzcrank. Was kind of a playmaker for the team, but it didn't really matter. Rogue didn't have the killer instinct. Their macro is genuinely horrible. They're never in the right place. They don't have the right positioning. This is not a good League of Legends team. 1-4 is indicative of their play strength. I just don't think this team is going to go very far. And then for G2, they're fine. I'm not going to freak out. Caps is that good, but there are problems on this team. There is a reason I'm genuinely concerned with, whether or not they're going to be able to keep this up over the course of playoffs. If they don't, it doesn't really matter. Again, I have to reiterate that. They could lose every single game this split, and it doesn't matter. They're still going to the season finals. I think they're probably still going to be the #1 seed at the season finals. It just doesn't end up mattering what ends up happening here, so I do think that they are going to play a bit weirder because of that, but you can still rely on Caps to carry games when needed. And then moving on here to game number 3 of day 2, a bottom of the table clash, which I don't think a lot of people expected to be a bottom of the table clash. GIANTX taking on Mad Lions Koi. and GIANTX is going to pick up their first win of the split in, quite frankly, a dominating victory. Mad Lions is in free fall mode. The panic button is being hit for this team because not only do they not look good right now, not only do they look like they're completely off of their game, but this might be a bottom 2 team. Like, genuinely, they're in a situation where they're going to have to compete to get out of those bottom 2 spots over the last 2 weeks, and that is really not where Mad Lions wanted to be after making finals, reminding you, making finals in the winter split. It really has been a bit of a disaster of a second half of the year for Mad Lions, but GIANTX picking up their first win. They're not going to go winless. Nobody in the LEC is going to go winless over the course of this split. That is a positive sign overall, and quite frankly, they played great in this game. You don't dominate the enemy team like they did without a lot of really good performances. There are 2 that I really want to highlight. Honestly, 3 that I really want to highlight, but 2 players that I think have been the strengths for GIANTX, and that's the solo laners, Antonio and Jackies, who have both been pretty good over the course of this split. Jackies is by far the best player on this team. On the Talia, I think player of the game could absolutely go to him. In this instance, I don't think he was the most valuable player in this game, but he certainly has been the most valuable player to GX overall over the course of this split. That's not even really all that debatable for me. His growth has been really, really fun to watch, and I think he's turned into a really solid mid laner. I hope that we can see him in a situation that's a little bit better than this moving into next year, but Antonio is going to get player of the game on the Poppy. You know, we've seen Poppy Top really kind of destroy the LEC. It feels like every single time that this is picked, the enemy team had absolutely no, preparation for it. They had no counter to it, and we kind of saw that again. Antonio has been playing really well. That's 3 games in a row that I would say he has been really positive for this team overall. He was great earlier this week against G2, even if things didn't go his way. He was really good down the stretch last week as well, even if he wasn't great in the first game or so, and then this was an amazing performance. He was just straight up better than Mirwin at every single turn. Not a huge shock to anybody who's followed this channel. I've kind of been out on Mirwin for a while. It seems public sentiment is catching up to that. We'll talk about that later, but Antonio is looking pretty solid, like pretty good for this team, and I think that's really good. If the solo laners can stay consistent, that's how GX can get out of bottom 2. I'm not saying that it's likely, but I'm definitely saying that it's possible for them not to be a bottom 2 team. And then shout out Patrick and Ignar. Patrick had his best game of the split by loads, by a giant margin. He was actually genuinely good in this game. That's not something he has been in a little while. He was actually capitalizing on the things that his team was creating for him, and that's all you really need him to do. You don't need him to go out there and be Superman. You just need him to capitalize on what Jackies, Antonio, and Ignar are setting up for him. Juhan goes deathless on the Vi, Ignar with a couple of good engages on Rel. This was just generally an all-around game for GX, but it really is the solo laners that make me excited for what GX could potentially do in the last couple of weeks. But for MDK, it's disaster. Like, there's really no other way to put it. The top side of this map is unplayable. Like, there really is no other way to explain what is happening to this team right now. I know people love to clown Supa for the claim of, like, oh, I'm the best AD carry in the world or in Europe or whatever he said. I get it, but the truth of MDK is that if Supa and Alvaro don't win bot, this team can't win games. Like, it literally is. Do Supa and Alvaro win bot? Okay, well, then they're going to be competitive. They're going to make things interesting. Do they lose bot? Okay, this team gets slaughtered. They have no one else on this team that's even performing at an adequate level right now. The top side of the map has been atrocious at the start of this split. Dud of the game is going to go to Elyoya. I'm going to be honest. Elyoya has not been particularly good since the winter split. Spring was a little bit weaker for him. I don't think he was a disaster, but it certainly was, kind of one of the weaker splits that we've seen from him at the LEC level. And so far in summer, he's been bad. Like, he's not just been weak. He has been bad. And that's really out of character for Elyoya, a player who I have a lot of, faith and trust in, a player who I've put a lot of, praise into over the course of this channel's history. He is playing genuinely awful right now. He was horrible on the Ivern, never was in the right position, was constantly just letting GX get whatever they wanted on the map. Just a really bad game and a really bad split so far for Elyoya. He's got to lock in, but the solo laners are not making it easy. Frescowy is somebody who I've, grown to like a little bit more than maybe I expected over the course of this year, but he is definitely in his weakest stretch as a pro so far. Not been a good summer split for him, but specifically it's been horrible for Mirwin in the top lane. Look, I know I was a bit early on the Mirwin hate train. Like, I know after winter I was saying, okay, guys, well, he had a really good stretch in winter where he was looking good in the playoffs, and then he wasn't good in the regular season in winter. He wasn't good in the regular season in spring. Like, there really wasn't a lot of reason for me to believe Mirwin was a consistent top laner under any circumstance. Like, we know the highs. We know he can pick up solo kills and, have flashy plays when he's on these weird counter picks. But from a game-to-game basis, he graded out as a negative player in winter, and he graded out as a negative player in spring as well. And I said that a lot on the channel, but even I couldn't couldn't have predicted him just being the worst top laner in the league. Like, he has not been competitive under any circumstance. He is not able to survive in lane. He's horrible out of lane. Like, laning phase is his strength, but his team fighting has been truly horrendous, like unplayable for a majority of this year, and he has just regressed in almost every way. It does not feel like he can even survive at this level right now, and if that's going to be the case, if your solo laners are going to get destroyed, if your jungle is going to regress immensely, if your bot lane is literally the only way you could potentially even maybe win a game, like MDK is going to be a bottom 2 team. That's the danger for them right now, so they have to watch out for that. Things are imploding around them, but for GX, this is a nice win. Does it get them out of the bottom 2? Obviously not in terms of record, but if they can string together 1 or 2 more wins, like 3 wins might be enough to get you out of bottom 2 in terms of how the LEC works right now. So, you know, for GX, this is the right step in that direction. Picking up that first win is big, but it's all going to be on the development and the continued success of these solo laners. But then moving on to our 4th game of the second day, and this is the one I was most looking forward to across the entire week. It's a battle of the 2 undefeated teams left in the LEC. Only one will be moving to 5-0. It's SK Gaming taking on Fnatic. And Fnatic is going to pick up the victory. Good on them. This team has carried over their momentum from the previous split in a way that even I couldn't have predicted. This team has been sensational. They are clearly the best performing team in the LEC right now. Even a team like SK that has looked so good leading up to this point had no chance of being able to take them down. Their problems, the top side of the map was just a little bit too much of an issue for them to be able to overcome. In Fnatic, they just have too many good players, and their players step it up when it matters the most. I'm really feeling it with this Fnatic team right now. The way that they are playing, it's hard not to get excited and not to get, you know, really interested in what this team could potentially do, and especially with G2 struggling, Fnatic could absolutely be the favorites to win the summer split right now, which would be huge for an org that hasn't done that in quite a long time. So let's go over it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Razork in the jungle. I have always been a bit of a Razork, I guess, I've been lower on Razork on this channel. That's the best way to say it. I'm not a Razork hater. I've never felt like I've been a Razork hater. I feel like I've just been the kind of guy that's like, he's inconsistent. He's going to have games that aren't particularly good to pair with the games that are particularly good. And so it's always just kind of been a back and forth, especially in 2023, which I felt was his most inconsistent year to date. You know, I was never really a huge fan of his on Misfits. I thought he was good. I didn't think he was elite. He came over to Fnatic. Him and Humanoid had trouble kind of getting that chemistry going. And last year, it all kind of came to a head with him losing a lot of early games and not really being able to transition out of losing situations all that successfully. But 2024 has been a complete turnaround. This is, without doubt, the best year of Razork's career. I don't even think that that's even remotely debatable. He has been a true star this year in a way that he never has before. Even his biggest, like, lovers, I think, will never be able to look at any other year other than 2024 for what Razork is capable of doing. This has truly been like a career-defining year for me, for him as a player, and he continues to look amazing. I mean, he obviously steals the smite, the 50-50 at the end of the game. That's pretty huge, and we'll get to Isma in a second, but just generally his play around a lot of these early situations is just so big. He is so consistent at getting his laners advantages. He's so consistent at getting himself into good positions, and he's really not a selfish player. Like, he doesn't need a ton of resources in order to be useful. He can really fill any kind of role right now. I think that he is, right now, the best jungler in the LEC. You know, Yike is somebody that I think will eventually kind of keep up with that. They are 1 and 2 in terms of their performances over the course of this year. You would hope that players like, you know, GIANTX would be able to fill that role as well, but Razork really has been that dominant and that strong. It's not just him, though. Humanoid and Noah, the 2 carries this game, were incredibly solid. Noah was a little bit more interesting to me. Going into Rahel and Luan, who have just kind of dominated everybody in the 2v2, Noah did a great job of holding his own, and not only that, but being super useful down the stretch. He, you know, is famously off of Twitter now. He's taking a break, and now he starts to play well. This is your reminder, if you need one, to just don't be on Twitter. Don't be on Reddit. Don't go to these places regularly. It's horrible for you. Trust me. But Noah is playing awesome. Like, this guy is tearing it up right now. He's playing the best league that he has so far this year. He was really good in summer of last year as well, obviously, and so it's nice to see that summer seems to be kind of his split. Humanoid got player of the game on broadcast. I agree. Hui is really, really strong, and Humanoid played it really well. I don't think he was quite as impactful as Razork and Noah, but he still was really good. Oscar, Jun, they're all looking good. Fnatic just looks really, really strong right now. They are a well-oiled machine. They have top-end talent. Razork, Humanoid, Noah, Jun, they're all playing elite right now. Even Oscar Oscar, I think, is playing really well. Fnatic is the scariest team right now in the LEC, and it's really only going to be up to maybe if G2 can turn things around to see if they can contest with them. There is a big difference between Fnatic and everyone else, but for SK, just minor differences, minor flaws that end up leading to them losing this game. You know, they were able to get a lot of gold onto their Tristana early on, but Niski dying in side lanes is certainly not an ideal situation. And then, of course, you know, having a quote-unquote lead in this game and then flipping a 50-50 is never ideal. That being said, generally speaking, I think Isma was pretty weak in this one. He's going to get dead of the game, and that is the concern with SK. It's not Rahel and Luan. I think they're going to be fine. Even someone like Niski was able to generate good advantages in this game, but their late game team fighting consistency with this collection of players might be a little bit more up in the air when they're actually going into that late game neutral, because Isma is a really bad team fighter, and we continue to see that. His biggest weakness is going to be his ability to play front-to-back 5v5s. It's why I don't really like him on things like Maokai and Sejuani, because those champions really thrive in those circumstances, and he's just not very good in that stage of the game. He's a really explosive early game jungler. He's got great pathing, and he's a really good skirmisher, really good ganker. That's kind of Isma's scouting report, but as a 5v5 team fighter, it's just never really been his strength. As an objective controller, that's never really been his strength, and he was asked to do both of those in this game against Razork and was not able to really come up with either, so that's going to be something that I think limits SK's upside in terms of being able to take down the best teams in the LEC. You know, it's a nitpick, but it's one that, you know, against a team like Fnatic, you have to look out for. Irrelevant also, just, again, when he doesn't win, he loses kind of hard, and he was super useless in this game on the Renekton. The top and the jungle were not all that good. Rahel, Niski, Luan, they were generally fine. They weren't the problem here. Again, there was a small lead for SK, and they had opportunities to win this game, but they just don't have the consistency or really the experience right now to be able to close out a close game like this. So I don't want to harp on it too much. I still think this team is good, and their win over BDS proved that. They're 4-1. It's not like this is a disaster zone for them, but Fnatic really is on a level above everybody else in the LEC, not named like peak G2 right now. It really feels very, very clear that Fnatic is the team to beat in summer, and I'm really excited to say that. And that's going to bring us to our final game of the week here in week number 2, and it is a pretty interesting one. It's K-Corp taking on Team BDS. And BDS is going to pick up the win. They're going to move to 4-1 with their only loss being to SK. K-Corp, unfortunately, with an 0-2 week to drop down to 2-3. That record definitely still looking a little bit better than maybe they have performed. Remember, there is absolutely no reason they should have won 2 games in week 1 instead of 1 with Mad Lions throwing that second game. It's really not been a great start to the split for K-Corp, who I think just expected things to turn around. They definitely are better. I want to make that case because this game was kind of a fiesta, and at least they were able to make it interesting in that regard, but they still struggle so much of being able to close out games, and that's such an integral part of actually being a good team. It's been their biggest problem all year long, is that they're really not all that bad at making things interesting. They've really not been all that bad at being okay in the early to mid game. The problem is their late game team fighting and their communication is subpar at the highest of levels, and that continues to be a huge issue for them. I don't imagine bringing in an import top laner and, you know, some players who have never played together. I don't imagine this has helped the communication problem, which has plagued KC throughout an entirety of this year. But for BDS on the other side, this was a bit of a fiesta. Certainly some problems. They are kind of the litmus test for the LEC right now. The teams that can beat them are really good. The teams that cannot beat them are probably not particularly good, or at least not consistent teams. And I think that's a good role for BDS, considering everything. They might even be a Worlds team because of it. That's how bad the LEC is, quite frankly, or at least inconsistent at the top of the standings the LEC is. But we continue to see Ice get put onto late game hyper carries and be able to perform in front-to-back team fights. He's going to get player of the game, you know, going up against Upset and Targamas, who have certainly had their problems over the course of this split in terms of macro decisions, in terms of micro decisions, and, you know, their respective cases. Ice was able to take advantage of that. He was able to stay relatively safe in the early game and then in the late game pop off on that Zeri. It's all he needs to do. We've seen him on Zeri. We've seen him on Jinx. Those are the champions that he's going to be playing for basically all of the split, or at least that's what I would anticipate with how they have played up until this point, and they want to put resources into him in that regard. It ended up working out in this case. I think Sheo was also relatively fine here on the Ivern. The Zeri was very difficult to kill, and a lot of that was Sheo. Now, I do want to say BDS was not perfect in this game. There were certainly some issues. Nuke in particular. Scoreline looks okay, but Nuke made some int-worthy plays throughout this one. Vladi was, quite frankly, just infinitely better on the other side of this mid lane matchup. Vladi's actually been impressing me in terms of his individual 1v1 skill. I think he's very strong in lane. Nuke not really able to hold up in that stage of the game. I get it, it's Tristana into Azir, but some horrible positioning errors down the stretch for Nuke. He was generally fine when it mattered the most, but still some worrying trends, I would say, for from the middle of the map here. Adam was just kind of there on the Yasuo, not the counter pick that I think he thought it would be on the top side, and Labrov, for the most part was dying for a lot of these plays, but you can live with that as long as he's getting a good engage off. He was better than Targamas on the other side of this matchup. Not clean at all from BDS. Certainly a very messy, a very sloppy game, but at the end of the day, when you have an AD carry that can win fights in the late game and is relatively consistent, you're still going to be able to overcome teams that are even more sloppy than you are, and that's where KC unfortunately ends up falling right now. Dead of the game is going to go to Targamas once again, and at this point, it's just kind of becoming what KC has to talk about. I get it. This one was not really entirely his fault. Honestly, I really don't think he was that bad in comparison to some of his other performances over the course of this year in this game, but he was the worst player on the team, and that means he does get dud of the game. I think that there were problems with him engaging at wrong times. Again, his micro is just so poor at the current moment. He makes bad in-the-moment decisions, and his mechanics really have not been able to keep up with the rest of the teams in the LEC. It's definitely disappointing to watch, but he was far from the only player who made mistakes. Upset was like 15 minutes to that final fight. Like, what are we doing? Like, where are you? What are you doing as Kaisa? Is the wave really that important to miss almost the entirety of the final fight? Closer really not all that good on the Maokai. Kana and Vladi were generally fine. Kana was definitely good on the top side, but didn't really have a huge impact on the Twisted Fate, and Vladi was definitely the best player on K-Corp, was definitely the better mid laner in this game, but he couldn't carry it on Tristana because you're going into Zeri, and you have to be able to one-for-one match that damage, and they just weren't able to do that. They didn't really have a bot lane, so K-Corp continues to just have major issues. This bot lane has been bad over the course of this split. I'd love to defend Upset, but I think the scorelines are a little bit better than maybe the performances would indicate. Targamas has been the worst player in the LEC over the course of 2024, and even with good performances and Vladi possibly being the best player on the team, K-Corp is still not going to be that compelling of a team. They're not going to be competing for top 5 or top 6. That's just not who they are. And then for BDS, again, they are the litmus test. They're not going to be world beaters. This team is fun to watch. They have a really good idea of how they want to play out this current meta, but they are sloppy, and their execution is still going to leave a lot to be desired at times. That's going to be enough to get over a lot of the teams in the LEC, but I don't have a ton of faith that they're going to be one of those teams that ends up being like scary on an international stage in any way. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC week number 2 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. All 10 games have been covered. Up on the screen now is going to be the updated standings after 2 weeks of action here in the LEC. Of course, any ties will just be broken alphabetically. No favoritism attempted to be shown on this channel. We've got one team alone in first, which is a pretty cool thing to see after 5 games. But in the first column to the right, you can see power rank. That's what I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10 after 2 weeks of action. In the change column, you can see how that has changed from last week to this week in the power ranking, so we can go over the risers and the fallers, where I personally feel a lot of these teams are going. 1 and 2 are going to stay the same, and that might shock some people. Fnatic is going to stay at number 2. They've looked better than G2 by a pretty enormous margin at the start of this split, but it's just hard for me to not imagine that G2 are still favorites to win this split. If anybody can dethrone them, it's Fnatic. Those two are a tier above everybody else in the LEC at the current moment, but if G2 is just kind of limit, testing and really not trying all that much this split, Fnatic is going to be the favorites. They are the only other team that I think will be competing for the LEC title, at least at the moment. SK Gaming, though, going to rise up to number 3. That bot lane is legit, and I imagine this team is still going to be a tough out against basically anybody that they face. I do want to see how they adapt to their loss to Fnatic. If they come back and they continue their loss streak, because that's kind of what's happened with SK, is the moment they lose momentum, they lose a lot of games. That's going to be concerning, but at least for now, that win over BDS gave me a lot of confidence, and that means they jumped them. BDS moves down to 4. Again, kind of the litmus test right now. If you're a good team, you're above BDS. If you are an inconsistent team, you are below BDS, and that's the case. Vitality jumping all the way back up to number 5. I don't feel like they feel like the 5th best team in the league, but there just aren't a lot of teams that I feel like deserve a top 6 spot, and Vitality at the very least look good this week, which is good. Hopefully they can keep that up. And then Heretics somehow, some way jumping back up to number 6. I don't feel good about this team at all, but I feel worse about the teams that are below them, and that just kind of ends up being the case with them jumping up here. K-Corp going to move down to number 7. There are real problems with this team. I think they have talent. Vladi in particular is someone who has impressed me up until this point, but they need to be able to harness that talent in their communication. Their macro simply has to get better. Mad going to move all the way down to 8. They're in real danger of being in the bottom 2 right now. I'm not going to predict that because I think they're too talented to be there, but again, they are such a one-dimensional playstyle at the current moment because 3 of their 5 players are just playing horrible, that if they don't figure that out, they're going to be in a disaster zone. Bottom 2 will stay the same for now, but GIANTX will jump Rogue. They'll move up to 9 because of their win. Rogue will move back down to 10. I think GX has the best player out of those 2 teams in Jackie's right now, and Antonio's also playing well. They just have more upside to me, but if anybody's going to jump out of that bottom 2, it'll probably be GX, and Mad Lions could potentially be joining Rogue down in that bottom 2 if everything goes wrong. So let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. None of these teams feel particularly great outside of the top 4, so it was a little bit difficult to find space for like a number 6 team, if you will, because, you know, Heretics downward all feel like teams that should not be in the top 6. So let me know what you think. Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below, but it's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week number 2. Player of the week was an easy choice. It's going to go to Karmine, 2 Ezreal games that both looked incredibly good. He was the most valuable player in the league this week. For as much as I've talked about his inconsistencies, he can have a week like this where he completely pops off. It's not really about this week, though. How is he going to follow up next week? And more specifically, how is Vitality going to follow up next week? I'm really interested to see where they go from here. And then my honorable mentions, my runner-ups, Noah, Razork, 2 Fnatic players. This team is just clicking on all cylinders. Both of these players are playing excellent. Noah, in particular, was the best player on Fnatic this week, which is super fun to see. Razork, also really good, as we talked about. But Karmine is going to get my player of the week. I felt like he was the most valuable to his team as a whole. And then dud of the week is going to go to Targamas, the support for Corp. He's gotten a couple of these over the course of this year. It just kind of is what it is when it comes to Targamas. He has not been able to perform at the LEC level for this team. He was not good last year either. There really just isn't much else to say. I wish I could give you more analysis, but I've given it so much over the course of this year that there really is not a lot left for me to give. Targamas is going to be dud of the week. Karmine is going to be player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comments section below. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Would love to hear your thoughts and opinions there. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LEC, we post about all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL every single week on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all